Welcome to Within the Frame, where we bring the most pressing issues across the globe into focus. I'm Kim Mok-yeon. It's been 3.5 years since the war in Ukraine began, and just as a glimmer of hope emerged from the Alaska summit between U.S. President Trump and Russian President Putin, that fragile progress has been overshadowed by Russia's latest large-scale assault on Kyiv. The August 28th attack left at least 21 dead, including 4 children, and over 48 injured, with EU offices and civilian buildings among the damaged. President Trump, visibly disappointed, remarked that neither Russia nor Ukraine seem to be ready to end the war. As public skepticism about peace prospects grows, questions are now being raised over whether peace talks have hit a point of no return. For a closer look into the situation, we invite Min Jung-hoon, professor at the Korean National Diplomatic Academy, here in the studio with us. Welcome.
Yeah, good evening.
And also joining us online is Daniel Connolly, associate professor of international relations at Hankuk University of Foreign Studies. Good to see you, Professor.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
So let's start a discussion with Professor Min. So the peace talks between Russia and Ukraine, it was once seen as very promising, are now facing serious roadblocks. Could you tell us what are the key points of contention between the two parties, particularly in terms of security guarantees and territorial disputes?
Well, I think that still Russia and Ukraine, they are just asserting their position strongly to gain the upper hand in the negotiations to end the war. The two countries hold different positions on both security guarantees and territorial issues. The first, regarding security guarantees, Ukraine maintains that NATO membership or similar collective security system is necessary. Meanwhile, Russia opposes Ukraine's NATO membership, but it would allow a collective security system with Russian participation, which it seems to be very implausible for the Ukraine and NATO member countries. And concerning the territorial issues, Russia demands the entire Donbas region, which is beyond its currently occupied Ukrainian territory. In return, Russia wants to return its controlled areas in the north to the Ukraine. But the north area that Russia wants to return is much more smaller than the Donbas region, which Russia wants to continue to occupy. Meanwhile, Ukraine refuses to make territorial concessions, but it is open to discussions at the trilateral meeting between Russia, Ukraine, and U.S. It reflects the Ukrainian people's fatigue and the concerns that in terms of the long war time, that they're tired and they just want to finish the war as quickly as possible. But anyway, I think these different positions have slowed the progress in the negotiations. And as you mentioned, President Trump is feeling fatigue from the current stalemate, and he is pushing both countries in terms of withdrawing from the negotiations if progress is not made. But anyway, but still, President Trump has an intention to make a decision to end the war if possible. So, given the situation where U.S. want to quickly end the war, mainly with the negotiations with Russia, I think the war is likely to find an exit in favor of Russia eventually.
So we'll have to see how it goes, but it seems as for now, the two sides are quite still far apart in terms of what they want. Now, building on this, both Ukraine and Russia have recently ramped up attacks on each other's energy infrastructure, like oil, gas, and power facilities, and many observers believe this is a strategic move to gain leverage ahead of a potential U.S.-led ceasefire deal. Professor Connolly, how do you assess this development?
Well, I think so, but there's a different logic between both sides. For the Ukrainians, a lot of these strikes on the Russian energy sector are a way of demonstrating success despite a worsening battlefield situation. So these strikes are not necessarily about persuading Russia to end the war, because Ukraine doesn't have that ability to inflict that level of strategic damage. Rather, these strikes are more about demonstrating to its European allies and international media that Ukraine is still in the war and therefore still deserves flows of money and weapons. For the Russians, on the other hand, the logic is quite different. For them, strikes on Ukraine can be problematic because the Western media always frames them as signs that Russia doesn't want peace or that Russia is targeting civilians. So as we saw the peace talks begin, Russia kind of calmed down on a lot of the strikes and are now kind of retaliating to these Ukrainian strikes on the Russian energy sector. And if you see today in the news, Trump periodically complaining about Russian strikes. This morning, U.S. envoy Keith Kellogg complained about Russian strikes on civilians. But for Russian war planners, these strikes are increasingly important, not only to deter Ukraine from attacking its own energy sector, but because we're approaching the winter. And this is a kind of a crunch time to weaken the Ukrainian defense industry. So ultimately, I think the sides are almost fighting two different kinds of war. The Ukrainian airstrikes and missile strikes are more of a public relations campaign towards its allies. The Russian strikes are more focused on an attritional military campaign.
Right. So as Professor Connolly mentioned regarding this, President Trump clearly isn't happy about it. He issued a stern warning saying without a ceasefire, Russia will face strong economic sanctions. Professor Min, in your view, how effective do you think would a warning be pressuring to Moscow?
Basically, I think the President Trump's warning on putting the severe economic sanctions to the economic partners of Russia, like China, India, which purchase their energy from Russia, would be the last resort to end the war, and it will effectively work following the President Trump's intention. But anyway, as you mentioned, President Trump has warned that U.S. would put severe economic sanctions against Russia if a deal to end the war would not be made. And President Trump said that the U.S. would impose severe secondary tariffs, the economic sanctions, targeting Russia's remaining trade partners like the India and China. So this would see those countries, India and China, face severe tax if they want to sell what they want to sell their products to the United States. For example, if India keeps buying oil from Russia, U.S. companies that purchase Indian goods would have to pay a higher import tax or tariff when the products reach American shores. So this would make the goods so expensive that U.S. businesses would likely to choose to buy them cheaper from elsewhere, not India, and resulting in lost revenue for India, the country. So the intention is also to hobble Russian economy. So theoretically, if Moscow was unable to make money by selling oil and energy to other nations, it would also have less money to finance its war in Ukraine. And Russia will get into serious trouble in terms of maintaining the war. So given that the oil and gas account for almost a third of Moscow's state revenue and more than 60% of its exports, economic sanctions with secondary tariffs could make a huge impact on Russia's wartime economy. And the same logic can be applied to the case of China, which has mainly purchased Russian energy along with India. Basically, China does not want to make its relations with Russia get worse by receiving the secondary tariffs from the United States. So overall, I think that President Trump's warning of putting the secondary tariffs would eventually work, and it will facilitate the negotiations to end the war. But still, Russia is resisting from President Trump's offer of making a ceasefire deal, because Russia and Putin think that it needed to expand its occupied territory as much as possible to the last moment, the world ceasefire.
Right. So it would be a strong but a last resort card for the U.S. president. But adding another layer to this, President Trump also hit at Ukraine by saying President Zelensky is not innocent either, raising the idea that both sides bear responsibility for the stalled peace process, of course. Professor Conley, could this signal a shift in the U.S. position from a mediator to a more neutral observer?
Well, I definitely think the Trump administration has swung more towards a balanced stance, if you want to call it that, especially, of course, compared to the Biden administration. But there's a lot of structural factors resisting Trump's shift. So if you think about the US domestic media, prominent figures such as Senator Lindsey Graham, pressure from European leaders, these are all really kind of limiting Trump's ability to shift the US to a more mediator role. And in fact, they're actually pushing America back towards this hardline anti-Russian stance. So we see these days in the media a very curious zigzag pattern where some days Trump talks like he's on the Russian side, and then other days he's criticizing Putin. And this is, I think, a reflection of domestic and international politics putting pressure on Trump. I should note, though, that even during the Biden administration, there were tensions between US policymakers and Ukrainian leadership. These tensions were usually kept quite quiet, and only now are we hearing about some of the spats between Biden and Zelensky. In the Trump administration, on the other hand, these spats tend to come out into the open, as exemplified by the infamous Oval Office meeting earlier this year. At the end of the day, though, the U.S. is a direct participant in the war, right? Their weapons are in Ukraine, they're part of NATO, NATO is supporting Ukraine. So even if Trump describes himself as an unwilling participant, the U.S. is still a participant, and that makes being a mediator quite difficult.
So Washington clearly looks to be a direct participant in this war. Now, speaking of which, President Zelensky is set to meet with high-level American officials today, August 28th, to explore the possibility of direct talks between Ukraine and Russia as well. So given this current landscape, Professor Min, what are the key variables that could influence the success or failure of these peace talks?
Yes, as you mentioned, it is expected that Ukrainian and U.S. officials will meet later today to discuss potential meeting between Ukraine and Russia. And the Trump government's Russian envoy, Steve Witkoff, confirmed that the meeting would take place in New York City. And the news came amid President Trump's push for a speedy peace deal to end the war in Ukraine. And after having separate meetings with Putin and Zelensky, President Trump said that the next step would be a bilateral summit between the two leaders. And if a bilateral meeting is held between the two leaders, it would mark the first encounter between the two leaders since the start of the war, like February 2022. And it is known that the talk of preparations are being held by the U.S. High-ranking officials like U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio, the Witkoff, and the Vice President J.D. Vance. And personally, I think the bilateral meeting could be a positive signal for finding an exit to end the war, but it's not certain whether or how much it will actually contribute to the war finishing efforts because there are many hurdles and considerations to make a progress to end the war. For example, it is known that Russia will not accept Zelensky's signature on legal documents establishing terms for an end to the war because Zelensky lacks political legitimacy because his term in office has been expired probably several months ago. And anyway, it is likely that the upcoming meeting between Putin and Zelensky could be a meaningful progress to end the war. But as I mentioned, it's not clear what kind of the concessions and the arguments that both sides would make in the meeting. And it is more likely that they just maintain they are asserting the arguments in terms of territorial issues and security guarantees. So it will be just a symbolic meeting to make a progress and to end the war. But it could be the good the start of some kind of the meeting between the two countries anyway, and we will see that the results of the meeting, the bilateral meeting, would be a useful indicator about whether they can narrow down their differences and how soon the war will be over. So we can see how much the gap the two countries have and how much the U.S. could narrow down the gap as a mediator.
Right, so we'll have to see if this could become a stepping stone towards further negotiations. Now, on a related note, North Korea has already supplied weapons and over 10,000 troops to Russia since last year. And as the war progresses, could the dynamics of the Pyongyang-Moscow relations begin to shift? Could you tell us about your forecast, Professor Connolly?
Well, I think both sides are finding the relationship very mutually beneficial. According to many reports, the North Korean military-industrial complex is working overtime to provide the Russian war machine, and in exchange, they may be getting technology and know-how. We see a lot of new, for example, air defense systems in North Korea these days. And as a sign of these close ties, we even saw last week Kim Jong-un kind of acknowledging at least 101 battlefield deaths in a very public ceremony commemorating them. The real question, though, is whether North Korean forces will be used in an offensive capability. Until now, they were used in the liberation of Kursk, which was Russian territory occupied by the Ukrainians. I think a sign of a very kind of important question that many people have is if the North Korean troops are actually used in Ukrainian territory, that would mark a very significant deepening of the Russian and North Korean relationship if it were to occur. There are no signs of that happening yet, but that is a potential sign of a changing relationship.
Right, so it's definitely all eyes are on how the ties would develop and deepen between the two countries. But if peace talks actually gain momentum, some people speculate that North Korea might pivot away from Russia and turn towards the U.S. And Pyongyang has even left room for some conditional dialogue. What are your thoughts on this, Professor Min?
Well, personally, I think that North Korea paid attention to what happened in the RK-US summit a few days ago. As you know, in the summit, the two leaders of South Korea and U.S. showed their strong intentions to get out of the stalemate in their relations with North Korea, and they would work together to revitalize President Trump's summit diplomacy and bring North Korea back to the negotiating table. But as you know, North Korea has been cautious in terms of the resuming its talks with the U.S., and it is still silent. But there is also a possibility that Pyongyang would respond to Washington's love call when a ceasefire deal is made in the Ukraine war. And as you know, North Korea has survived with the help of Russia over the past few years, and the cooperation between North Korea and Russia has strengthened over time. But if a ceasefire deal is made for the war, the two countries would have different positions in their cooperation. And there is also a possibility that Russia will play a mediating role to revitalize the semi-diplomacy between North Korea and U.S. So whether and when a ceasefire deal is made in the war could make a significant impact on North Korea and U.S. relations, the inter-Korean relations, and overall political and security situations on the Korean Peninsula. And it is also likely that North Korea would get back to the negotiating table if the U.S. offers like a small deal, which has simultaneous and parallel measures without requesting the declaration of the denuclearization of the North Korea at the beginning of those nuclear talks.
Right, so the situation seems to be very complex and all tied to each other. We hear that North Korean leader Kim Jong-un is expected to attend the September 3rd military parade in China. We hear so North Korean leader, Chinese leader, and Russian leader also will appear together at these parade. Then, Professor Min, how might this trilateral moment reshape the strategic landscape in Northeast Asia?
Yes, the Chairman Kim Jong-un, Chairman Kim will make his first visit to China in 6 years, to attend the military parade next week. And it will be his debut to the multi-nation event that would bring him together with a large group of world leaders for the first time since his taking office in 2011. And since taking office, the Chairman Kim has met President Xi, the Putin, Donald Trump, and the former South Korean President Moon Jae-in and others. But all those summits were bilateral meetings. And the Chairman Kim hasn't attended any big multilateral events with the foreign leaders. So it will be the first time that President Xi, Chairman Kim, and President Putin gather at the same event. So the world is paying attention to what's going on there in Beijing. And the three leaders like to share desires to check the strengthening cooperation among South Korea, US, and Japan. But it's not clear how far they would go to further strengthen their ties because they have different strategic considerations and national interests behind the curtain. So anyway, the Chairman Kim's visit to China could also be related to efforts to restart diplomacy with Trump. As you may remember, Chairman Kim visited to China 4 times from 2018 to 2019 to meet President Xi. And his first and the fourth visit happened just before he met President Trump for the nuclear negotiations. So North Korea, North Korea has been silent on the Trump's outreach so far, but it is likely that it would return to talks if U.S. would make bigger concessions in terms of the denuclearization or the nuclear talks. So overall, the Chairman Kim's visit to Beijing this time signals that there could be significant changes in the dynamics of diplomacy among East Asian countries. But in terms of how the Ukraine war would be over and what the positions Russia could take after the war and how it would affect the North Korea's calculations in terms of shaping the relations with the U.S. and South Korea. All those situations would work together and probably would create new situations, but they'll relate and they affect each other. But so we'll see what will happen.
Right, so we could be looking for a whole new phase in the Northeast Asia power balance. We'll keep close attention to the developments. But as for now, we'll have to wrap our discussion at this point. Thank you so much for your time and for your insights tonight, Professor Min.
Thank you.
And Professor Connolly, we appreciate it so much. And that'll be all from us on Within the Frame. Be sure to tune in again next time as we continue to explore the stories that matter. Till then, stay informed and engaged.